In the vast and unforgiving deserts along the southern coast of the Persian Gulf, a group of small sheikhdoms once lived in isolation, ruled by ancient traditions and tribal customs. But in the 19th century, the winds of empire began to blow across the Arabian Peninsula, bringing with them European ambitions, political treaties, and foreign control. What began as informal agreements soon grew into a system of indirect rule by the British Empire, giving birth to a period of control known as the Trucial States era. From the early 1800s until 1971, this era shaped the foundations of what would eventually become the modern United Arab Emirates. This documentary explores the complete story of British control, the roots of Arab resistance, and the birth of a new nation from the desert sands. Before the arrival of the British, the coastal regions of what is now the United Arab Emirates were known to the outside world as the Pirate Coast, a name given by British officials due to the frequent raids carried out by local tribes, especially the Qawasim, who controlled powerful fleets operating from Ras Al Khaimah and Sharjah. For centuries, these tribes lived off the sea, relying heavily on fishing and the pearl diving industry, which thrived in the calm waters of the Gulf. The seasonal rhythm of life was dictated by the tides and the movement of the pearling season. Families would move to the coast in the summer months and return inland during winter, forming a unique maritime desert culture. The Gulf was a crossroads for trade. Centuries, caravans moved goods inland, while ships brought foreign products from India, Persia, and East Africa. This created a thriving but vulnerable society, heavily influenced by regional politics and tribal alliances. The ruling sheikhs wielded authority through consensus and tradition, often balancing relations with both neighboring tribes and larger regional powers, such as the Ottoman Empire and Persia. By the late 1700s, however, tensions were rising in the region, especially between the Qawasim and the British presence in the Indian Ocean. The British East India Company wanted to protect its trade routes and saw the maritime strength of the Qawasim as a threat. This led to increasing conflict that would ultimately change the destiny of the region. In 1809, the British launched their first major naval expedition against Ras Al Khaimah, destroying ships and fortifications in a brutal display of force. But this was only the beginning. By 1819, a second and more destructive campaign led to the signing of the General Maritime Treaty in 1820 between Britain and several Gulf sheikhs. This agreement marked the beginning of formal British involvement in the internal affairs of the coast and the start of what would become the Trucial States system. The signing of the General Maritime Treaty in 1820 marked a turning point in the relationship between the British Empire and the sheikhdoms of the Gulf. It was a moment when informal influence transformed into formal control. Under this treaty, several local rulers agreed to cease piracy in exchange for British protection of their maritime activities and sovereignty on land. This was not a treaty between equals. It was an arrangement where the British dictated the rules of the sea and gradually extended their power over the political structures of the coast. The treaty led to the creation of what became known as the Trucial States. The name derived from the maritime truces signed in the following decades. In 1835, the Perpetual Maritime Truce was established, effectively giving the British Royal Navy the right to patrol and enforce peace along the Gulf waters. The sheikhs became dependent on British mediation for resolving disputes and maintaining coastal security. This system allowed the British to maintain a network of political agents across the region, based primarily in Sharjah and later in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Their presence influenced local leadership and succession, often tipping the balance of tribal rivalries. Without formal colonization, Britain had effectively created a protectorate system in all but name. Meanwhile, the Gulf economy continued to be dominated by pearl diving. This fragile industry supported thousands of divers, boat captains, and merchants whose lives were tied to the success of each season. The British presence brought stability to trade routes, but it also introduced new dynamics as Indian merchants under British protection began to dominate local markets, leading to growing economic inequality. Despite these changes, traditional tribal structures remained strong. The authority of the sheikhs was rooted in loyalty, negotiation, and lineage. British political officers learned to navigate this landscape through careful diplomacy and an understanding of tribal codes. However, the control was real and growing, and the foundations for deeper British involvement were being laid year after year, decade after decade. By the end of the 19th century, the Trucial States had become a defined geopolitical space, governed not by a central power, but by a network of agreements and understandings between the British Empire and each local ruler. This was not a federation, nor a colony, but something in between, a unique political entity that reflected both Arab tradition and imperial necessity. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, life in the Trucial States was shaped by resilience, simplicity, and adaptation. The coastal towns like Sharjah, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Ras Al Khaimah were small yet vibrant centers of trade and pearling, while inland areas were home to nomadic tribes who navigated the arid desert with expertise passed down through generations. The dominant economic force of the era remained the pearl diving industry. Each year, during the pearling season, thousands of men set out into the Arabian Gulf on wooden boats called dhows, diving into the warm waters with nothing but a nose clip and a weighted rope. The risks were high and the rewards uncertain, but the industry bound together communities in a shared rhythm of life. Pearl merchants in coastal markets controlled the pricing and grading of pearls, while tribal leaders regulated the movement of labor and boats. This was not an economy of luxury, but survival and cooperation. Entire families depended on the success of a few months of diving. The British maintained their naval presence in the Gulf, ostensibly to protect these economic activities from piracy. But their deeper interest was in maintaining control over the flow of commerce and ensuring British India's maritime security. Social life was rooted in tribal affiliations, kinship, and the guidance of the ruling sheikhs. These leaders were often selected based on a combination of tribal respect, lineage, and political skill, rather than inherited monarchy as understood in the West. Their authority was strengthened or weakened by the alliances they maintained with both neighboring tribes and with British representatives. Education was minimal, often centered around Quranic schools and oral traditions. Children learned from their elders and from the rhythm of life itself. Women played crucial roles within the family and community, though public roles were limited under conservative traditions. Their knowledge of herbal medicine, childbirth, and social cohesion was indispensable. Despite British efforts to portray themselves as neutral arbiters, their presence had growing effects on tribal dynamics. Certain tribes and leaders benefited from closer ties to the British political agency, receiving arms, trade advantages, or diplomatic support, while others found themselves marginalized or excluded from regional power negotiations. Over time, traditional systems began to feel pressure from the modernizing influence of British interests. Though infrastructure remained limited, the very act of drawing borders, signing treaties, and navigating imperial politics began to change the internal workings of these desert societies. The identity of the people of the Trucial States remained rooted in Arab culture, Islamic values, and tribal honor, but the winds of external influence were blowing stronger with each passing year. This was a world in balance between tradition and empire, a land of proud tribes bound by honor, navigating a future increasingly shaped by forces from across the seas. As the 20th century progressed, resistance against British control began to take firmer shape across the Trucial States. While direct armed rebellion was rare, the spirit of resistance burned in the hearts of tribal leaders, poets, merchants, and the general population who yearned for autonomy and cultural preservation. Tensions often simmered beneath the surface, especially when British political agents attempted to intervene in tribal disputes or dictate terms of internal governance. These efforts were seen not as acts of protection, but as attempts to weaken traditional authority and replace it with a puppet-like dependency on the empire. Sheikhs of towns like Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah occasionally voiced dissatisfaction through political gestures and refusals to follow certain British directives, but their power was limited by treaty obligations and by the looming threat of economic sanctions or forced political isolation. Resistance also came in the form of protecting Islamic identity and tribal traditions against Western cultural intrusion. British officials often attempted to introduce secular legal codes and administrative systems that clashed with the region's Islamic and customary laws. The people of the Trucial States resisted these efforts through the preservation of Sharia practices and by reaffirming loyalty to tribal leadership over colonial administrators. A notable episode of symbolic resistance occurred in 1945 when Sheikh Shakbut of Abu Dhabi began pushing back against British involvement in internal financial matters. Frustrated with British control over oil negotiations and economic planning, he took steps to assert greater control over his Emirates' affairs. This moment, although not a rebellion, was a signal that the tide of political consciousness was rising among Gulf leaders. Literature, poetry, and oral storytelling also played key roles in the resistance movement. Poets recited verses in market squares and majlis gatherings that critiqued British power and praised Arab unity and heritage. These cultural expressions were not just art, they were tools of memory, resistance, and identity preservation in a time of outside pressure. The rise of Arab nationalism in the broader Middle East, especially following events in Egypt and Iraq, began to influence the Trucial States. Educated youth and traders who traveled to Bahrain, Kuwait, or even Cairo returned with new ideas about independence, sovereignty, and Arab solidarity. This intellectual resistance planted seeds that would bloom in the decades to follow. By the 1950s, the winds of change were becoming undeniable. Oil discoveries were reshaping power dynamics, and political awareness was growing. Britain struggled to maintain the illusion of partnership as more leaders in the Gulf began to see the relationship as exploitative and outdated. The Arab world was stirring, and the Trucial States were no exception. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the global political environment was shifting rapidly. As decolonization movements swept through Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, the British Empire found itself increasingly unable to maintain its traditional grip on far-flung territories, especially in the Gulf, where maintaining control became more costly and diplomatically risky. Within the Trucial States, signs of transformation were everywhere. Oil revenues were beginning to flow, allowing the ruling sheiks to invest in infrastructure, education, and local governance. This financial independence slowly weakened the need for British oversight and empowered local leaders to imagine a future beyond colonial shadow. Britain, aware of its declining power in the region, began considering withdrawal plans, but feared instability if a power vacuum emerged. British authorities urged the Trucial States to cooperate more closely among themselves, leading to the formation of the Trucial States Council in 1952. This council served as a forum for inter-emirate discussion, but lacked real authority or unity. Its existence, however, laid the groundwork for something far greater: the rise of strong individual leaders, especially Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan of Abu Dhabi and Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed Al Maktoum of Dubai, would become critical in the next chapter of Gulf history. Both envisioned a united federation capable of standing on its own without reliance on British protection. Their personal friendship and political alignment helped bridge divides between emirates and created momentum toward unification. Throughout the 1960s, Britain's economic struggles intensified, and its global priorities shifted. The British government eventually announced in 1968 its decision to withdraw from east of Suez by 1971. This sudden declaration sent shockwaves across the Trucial States. The sheikhs were left with only a few years to build a national framework and negotiate a future free from British supervision. Talks among the 7 emirates intensified, fueled by the urgency of British withdrawal and the desire for regional security. Qatar and Bahrain initially participated in the federation discussions, but later opted for separate independence. However, the remaining 7 states pressed forward, guided by the vision of unity, sovereignty, and modern statehood. On December 2, 1971, the United Arab Emirates was born, with 6 of the emirates joining on that day, and Ras Al Khaimah following shortly thereafter. This historic moment marked the end of the Trucial States and the beginning of a new era, one that embraced independence, development, and national pride. The legacy of British control was complex, While the British had helped mediate conflicts and provided some infrastructure, their presence also delayed self-rule and restricted economic sovereignty for decades. The era of the Trucial States is remembered not only for its treaties and political intrigue, but for the quiet, steady resistance that grew within its people. In modern times, the United Arab Emirates stands as one of the most successful and stable nations in the Middle East. Its journey from fragmented tribal territories under foreign protection to a united modern federation is a testament to the vision, resilience, and unity of its leaders and people. The story of the Trucial States is not just a tale of colonialism and resistance, but one of transformation and hope.